What's up, guys? So in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of the symbols are in John Palenkar's paintings. And I'm going to start by telling you guys a quick story about how I discovered some of these things. So obviously, I found a lot of Freemason associations with a lot of the people in the secret book. So the first thing that I did was try and contact some Freemason lodges. I contacted both the Scottish Rites Freemason lodges, and I also contacted several regular Freemason lodges. I did not get many responses. The Scottish Rites Freemasons were pretty standoffish. They didn't really want to talk to me, didn't want to meet with me. The regular Freemason lodges, several of them didn't get back to me. Only one person from a Freemason lodge got back to me, and just for his own privacy and safety, I'm just going to call him David, even though that's not his real name. I spoke to David for about 30 minutes. He was a real nice guy. He wouldn't tell me anything about Freemasonry aside from the general things that you could find on their website. But when I tried to talk to him about the book, The Secret, he did not have any idea of what The Secret was about. But he did take a look through it. And one of the things that he pointed out pretty quickly was that there was actually a picture, one of John Palenkar's picture, that reminded him a lot of a Freemason picture. And that's how I got started investigating and researching more about these esoteric and other philosophies that inspired a lot of John Palenkar's paintings. So with that, I'll get started. So here on the left, I have a picture of the Houston picture drawn by John Jude Palencar, and on the right, after some digging, I found a picture that most likely David was talking about. They have a few variations of this picture. It's pretty famous, pretty important within Freemasonry. So there are a couple of different depictions, but this is what happens when you join. You're an initiate, and your growth up the ladder of Freemasonry. But you can see that in both pictures, they have three columns. On the left, they have a sphere on top, a camel, and a rhino. But here, this is what they look like in the Freemasonry diagram. All the columns are basically the same size and in the same position on both sides, on both pictures. In the middle, you have the jinn or the genie in the Houston picture. On the right, you have the initiate right in the middle, very similar, of course. Also, the floor in the Freemason diagram is a checkered floor. On the Houston picture, it's not quite checkered, but it has the same kind of outline of it, except for a little bit on the front. And also on the top of the picture, you have what appears to be a star right there. And then on the Freemason picture, you have the sun. I did see one other picture when I was doing some research that kind of looked like it would fit. And when I was looking up sorcerer or magician, there was a picture here of the magician, a tarot picture. And you can see how it has kind of these vines around the top edge. And you kind of have the same thing on the secret picture. So if you just combine the two and superimpose them, you would get something that looks like this. And you can see how similar they are with the star at the top where the sun is, also the candle, the outline of some trees or vines on the outside, and then the columns, floor, and everything being very, very similar. So you can see that the Houston picture is just a composite sketch of Freemasonry. So the next picture I'm going to be talking about is the Roanoke picture. Before I get started though, a lot of this information that I'm going to be talking about you can find on Wikipedia. There's a series under esotericism. If you want to do more research and learn more about it, be my guest. But here under esotericism, you have societies, Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, Thelema, Theosophy, and some concepts that we'll be talking about like Kabbalah and alchemy and other things like that. But in this particular photo for Roanoke, what we're going to be talking about is Rosicrucianism. Now, in the Wikipedia page, you can see that Rosicrucianism is associated in some Freemasonry. There are Masonic rites that correlate to it. Rosicrucianism is pretty old. Back in 1530, it existed in Portugal, namely around the home of the Knights Templar, which changed to the Order of Christ. We'll talk about a little bit later. And then also Paracelsus, I've talked about him a little bit, but he wrote things that Rosicrucianism is heavily based on as well. Now, the symbol for Rosicrucianism is a cross with a rose on it, and you can see in the Roanoke picture, the tunic or whatever the knight's armor is wearing kind of has this red tunic on. This wouldn't match up particularly well. There's actually another picture which I feel works a lot better, and that's going to be under the AMORC, which stands for the Ancient Mystical Order of the Rosy Cross. And this is what the symbol looks like. And if I was to superimpose this symbol on top of the Roanoke picture, you can see that it matches up pretty well with the design concept here. Stretched from end to end, the rose is right in the middle where the red tunic is, and the head is right where the needle is on this knight, and it matches up pretty perfectly. Also, the base is somewhat reminiscent of this picture right here, which is Temple of the Rose and Cross back in 1618. If we were to turn this to the side and match this up, the design concept is somewhat similar. So you have a rose and cross on top of this base structure right here. Now, some famous Rosicrucians include Sir Francis Bacon, Robert Fludd, Paracelsus, who we've talked about before, Rene Descartes, Sir Isaac Newton, and Benjamin Franklin. So some of those names you might see a little later as well. But within the book, The Secret, there is one clue that kind of refers to Sir Isaac Newton, and that would be the calculus. And here you can see on Isaac Newton's Wikipedia page, he developed calculus, developing it years before the person he shares credit with. But the calculus is somewhat of a reference to Sir Isaac Newton, who was one of the most famous Rosicrucians and one of the most famous people in history. So good to note that. And now we'll move on. Here is the Milwaukee picture on the left, and the concept I'm going to be talking about here is something called anima mundi, which basically means the soul of the world. It's a Greek and Roman philosophy. You could read a little bit more about it if you'd like, but the thing that kind of gives it away that this is what is being talked about is that it talks about the notion of the 7 classical planets. And here in the picture, the juggler has 7 objects in his hand: the Milwaukee, the 2 red balls, and then the gem. So, and then also the flower. So 7 objects. And if we were to look at the picture, we have a picture here that was created by Robert Fludd, who we just mentioned in Rosicrucianism. But if we were to compare the person standing on the anima mundi, you could see that the face is very similar to the juggler's face, except this person obviously isn't wearing any clothes, but same kind of hairstyle. Hands are pointed in the same direction, with the exception of the right arm. Here, the right arm is turned to the left just to make more of a juggling acrobat as he is. But the body shape and what they're doing is very similar. And here you have another version of what the Anima Mundi would look like with the 7 planets aligned. These kind of match up pretty well with the juggler and what he has in his hands and the direction where the planetary symbols are going. So if you wanted to superimpose it on top, it would look very similar, but this picture right here is Anima Mundi. Here we have the Cleveland picture. What's most associated with this picture is going to be Zoroastrianism. It's one of the world's oldest religion. It's still in existence today, and it could be as old as 4,000 years old, possibly from the 2nd millennium BC, but it was first recorded back in the 6th century BC, so as old as 4,000 years old, but at least about 2,700 years old. The main symbol for Zoroastrianism is going to be something called the Faravahar. And you can see a little bit of similarities between the Faravahar and the centaur, kind of how their hands are and the shape of the body. If I was to superimpose the Faravahar on top of the centaur, this is what it would look like. And you could see that the hands line up instead of a bowl that the centaur has is the ring in the Faravahar's hand, and this arm, instead of being forward, is arched back on the centaur. They both are wearing either a hat or a crown, and the 2 sides of the wings, one side of the wing matches the body of the centaur, and I guess the lower half of the tail feathers of the bird go over the legs of the centaur pretty well. And also the stem lands right where the circle and triangle are. So this is a pretty close representation of Zoroastrianism right here. Also, I mentioned earlier when I was talking about demons or daemons, this word actually comes from Zoroastrianism before it was transferred to Judaism during the Persian era, so this is kind of our reference in the book. Also, I wanted to mention that the structure that the centaur is standing on, this is most likely a representation of Solomon's temple. But in the picture, here's a 16th century reconstruction of what it looked like. You'll always notice that there are two pillars in front of Solomon's temple as well as a door. And this right here pretty much matches what the front entrance of Solomon's temple would have looked like. Also, I know a lot of people always wonder what this circle and triangle is all about. Because this is a Greek picture, most likely this has to do with Euclid and his book, The Elements. And inside his book, The Elements, he talked a lot about circles and triangles in his books. So this is probably going to be a reference to Euclid. You may hear or see that name a little later. But here you have Zoroastrianism, Euclid, and Solomon's Temple all in this picture. Here on the left we have the Charleston picture with the lion and the butterfly, and this is going to be comparable to the esoteric philosophy of Thelema. Thelema was founded by a guy named Aleister Crowley, and this guy was a very interesting person to say the least. If you want to watch his biography, they have one on YouTube. Very interesting is about all I could say about him. The symbol for thelema is something called the unicursal hexagram. And if you look at the unicursal hexagram, you can see it has what looks to be a 5-leaf clover in the center of it. And if you were to look at the butterfly here, you could see the head and the two breasts of the fairy along with the two sides make something that looks like a 5-leaf clover. If we were to superimpose the unicursal hexagram over the butterfly, you could see that the unicursal hexagram does kind of fit the butterfly. Not 100% as some of the other ones look like, but this is what I believe it to be. Also in the book, under the post-monster general, it talks about a person named Isadora Duncan. And Isadora Duncan actually met Aleister Crowley. And here you could see that she was actually a motivation for one of the characters in his book Moonchild. So here's a reference to the person that created Thelema, Aleister Crowley. Now also in this picture I wanted to talk real briefly about the lion's head. The lion's head reminds me a lot of the Scottish Rites Freemason symbol, which is the double-headed eagle. And while the double-headed eagle does have a little bit of a similar look to the lion's head, there are different variations of the double-headed eagle. And one that I found that fit a little more of what I was trying to represent was this double-headed eagle. But if I superimposed this picture onto the lion's head, you could see that the head kind of matches the double-headed eagle, and right where the holes are where the eyes come through, and it does look like a lion. So I also believe that the head of the lion is also in the shape of the Scottish Rites Freemason double-headed eagle. That is Charleston. We'll move on. Here we have the Chicago picture, which has to do with theosophy. But before I start, I just wanted to mention something that I forgot previously about the Chicago picture. There's the Chicago Water Tower, which I forgot to mention about earlier in the Chicago videos. There's a website called the Midnight Masons, and in this website they actually talk about the Chicago Water Tower specifically, and on the corner there's actually a placard that says laid by the Masonic Fraternity, March 25th, 1867, Jerome R. Corrin, MW, which stands for Most Worshipful Grand Master. So The Freemasons had something to do with the Chicago Water Tower. And I think it's kind of funny at the bottom. It says, next time you're visiting the Chicago Magnificent Mile, keep in mind the Masons were first to anchor the way. Now, as far as the Chicago picture goes, this is going to have to do with Theosophy. Theosophy was a religious movement founded in the 19th century by a Russian woman named Helena Blavatsky, and it draws heavily from both older European philosophies like Neoplatoism and Indian religions like Hinduism and Buddhism. And if you were to look at the symbol or the emblem that they use, there are many various things in here that make up the Theosophy symbol. At the top is what's known as the Om. You have a swastika. This isn't the German swastika, but the Buddhist swastika. Here the snake is called an Ouroboros. This triangle right here is the seal of Solomon. And right in the middle you have the Egyptian Ankh. And their philosophy is there is no religion higher than truth. Now, if I was to superimpose this emblem on top of the Chicago picture, you can see that it matches pretty well with what's going on here. The Ouroboros is right around the L for fair person's neck. You have the Ankh right in the middle, which is where the eye is. Even though in reality the Ankh is actually to the left, you could actually see the Ankh a lot better over the ear. And the nose of the fair person matches out to the earring. Everything is very symmetrical in this version. In terms of the Om is actually on the side of the left side where the eye is. And if you wanted to see the swastika is actually in the castle. So if I just pulled it up in paint so you could see the outline of the swastika up top. The Ankh is right here on the ear. The Om is right there. And the Ouroboros is around the neck right there, and everything fits circularly around. The symbol of Solomon composes most of the face, and everything is geometrically aligned with that triangle as well. So you can see Theosophy is what's going on in this picture. Also, real quickly, I wanted to point out that in the book we talk about Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison was actually a member of the Theosophical Society, joining in April 1878. Even though he might not have been in there too long, apparently he tried to distance himself from the group at a later time. Also in the book, they talk a lot about baseball, make references to a lot of baseball teams like the Dodgers, the Giants, the Yankees, the Blue Jays, and whatnot. The person who actually invented baseball or was given credit for inventing baseball was a guy named Abner Doubleday. In his Wikipedia page, you could see that he supposedly invented the game in 1839 at Cooperstown, which is where the Baseball Hall of Fame is, but later that was debunked and he did not get credit for it. But for a while, he was assumed as the person that invented the game of baseball. A couple of things to note about Abner Doubleday was he was a Union Major General in the American Civil War, and he fired the first shot in defense of Fort Sumter, which is in Charleston, South Carolina, and we know that there's some references to Fort Sumter there, so another connection. And also, after the war, he was in San Francisco, and he obtained a patent on the cable car railway that still runs there. So he was one of the guys that founded the San Francisco cable car. And after all of that, he was the president of the Theosophical Society as well. So a lot of connections to a lot of things that we've talked about. Now we'll move on. Next, here we have the San Francisco picture. And I don't think it would surprise anybody if I said that this Chinese figure has to do with Buddhism. Buddhism, obviously an ancient Indian religion and philosophy, dates back to the 6th or 5th century BC, so it's the world's 4th largest religion and one of the older religions in the world. We actually looked at what the Buddha looks like. If I superimposed a Buddha over this face where the hands are crossed, you could tell that's where the legs are crossed. And I used the different Buddha here. This one includes the 7 chakras in Buddhism, 7 being a number you might want to remember. But the Buddha fits very perfectly with the upper half of the female in the San Francisco drawing. Also, if you were to look on Freemasonry websites, this one is called Craftsman Online 33 Degrees in Freemasonry. They actually talk about Buddhism and chakras. And further down the page, they talk about Scottish Rite degrees and chakras. So this is something that's known to Freemasonry, Buddhism, and chakras. Also, the rose on the left side of the female has a curved lower stem. This is very reminiscent of something called an unalome. You can see here they have a curled tail at the bottom, and the two leaves on the side very similar to the design of an unalome. And an unalome is basically a sacred symbol representing the path to enlightenment and the journey of life. Also, I wanted to mention the dragon in the middle of the Asian woman's outfit, very reminiscent of something called the Rod of Asclepius. This is more Greek. It doesn't have to do with Asian mythology or anything like that, but if you were to take a look at what the Rod of Asclepius looks like, it's a serpent around a staff. They have something similar called the caduceus, which has two snakes around the staff. This is actually a medical symbol right here, but in versions of the Rod of Asclepius, it has this little circular dot at the top, very reminiscent of the pearl right in the middle of the Asian woman's neck. So this could also be a Rod of Asclepius reference, and the Rod of Asclepius is basically a representation of healing, medicine, and renewal. So those are the things worth mentioning as far as Buddhism goes in the San Francisco drawing. Now I'm going to skip over the Boston picture. For now, I'll save that for last since it's the cover art for the secret book. But I will talk about the St. Augustine picture now. The most comparable thing I found to it was something called Religio Medici, which stands for the religion of a doctor. And it was published by a guy named Sir Thomas Browne. This guy was a English polymath, and he did a lot of work in diverse fields like science, medicine, religion, and esoteric studies. Now, the Religio Medici is actually the first known English language reference to Zoroastrianism, which we talked about previously. But if you were to look at the front page of what the Religio Medici looks like, very similar to the St. Augustine picture. Here you have a rock formation that goes up, and on the right side is kind of blank, and then down below you have water. Even though in the book Religio Medici, the bottom half is more covered with water, here it has more of land. And in the shadow of the Religio Medici, this is where John Jude Palancar puts in this little mountain right here, which he uses as a symbol for the Ponce de Leon Fountain of Youth Park. And here you also have a horse at the top. We'll talk about that a little later. And the only thing he didn't really copy was the angel or whatever it is falling out of the sky. But you also see the clouds and a lot of pretty cloud covers on the side. So the St. Augustine picture most likely is in reference to the Religio Medici. Now we'll move on. Here we have the Montreal drawing of the man just in the middle of the picture. I said before that this kind of is reminiscent of a Rembrandt drawing, and I'll be talking about art in another video. But here you can see that the main picture is just based squarely in the middle of the photo. The lower half of the photo is really too dark, whether that's because of lighting or the inability of some of the scanners to pick up what's at the bottom. Really hard to tell. Maybe somebody could elaborate if there's anything at the bottom at all in a clearer picture. But for the most part, this is very close and symptomatic of Kabbalah. And Kabbalah is an esoteric method, discipline, and school of thought in Jewish mysticism. This dates back to at least the 12th or 13th century. Now, if you were to look at what the Kabbalah looks like, you could see that it is very straight. This is called the Kabbalistic tree of life. And if I was to superimpose this tree of life over the picture, you could see that it lines up pretty squarely right in the middle of the picture, and most things match up. Of course, it's a little off kilt, but everything matches up pretty well. At the top is where the gem is. On both sides of the head is the Kabbalah symbols. They cross right at the neck. On the left and the right side is the flower and the other symbol. The hands folded at the bottom middle match pretty well, and then the sleeves also match up pretty well. The only thing that's hard to see is, of course, at the bottom because there is no bottom, it's all black. But for the most part, everything lines up pretty well with a Kabbalistic tree of life diagram. So I'm going to say that this is related to the Kabbalah, and I'll move on. Next, we have the New York picture on the left, and this is probably going to be one of the easiest pictures to identify as the Virgin Mary. On Wikipedia, they call her Mary, Mother of Jesus, but there's a lot of other ambiguations of names for her. But there's also a lot of different pictures of the Virgin Mary. In the end, I found one at a local church in the Los Angeles area. The church name was Our Lady of the Angels. But here is the picture that I found on one of the walls in Our Lady of the Angels. And you can see the striking resemblance of the picture in New York as well as the picture in Los Angeles. The head and the face, very similar in a sense. The outstretched arms on both sides, very similar. The tunic and the garb, very similar as well. The only main difference is the New York photo. You can't see her feet, but maybe you can see a bit of an outline. But this is just to represent the island of Manhattan. And on the picture from the church, you can see the bottom of her feet. But the tunic, the hands, the face, all outstretched, very similar. This is no doubt in my mind a picture of the Virgin Mary. Also, I just wanted to point out, since I found this picture at the Cathedral of Our Lady of Angels, the term Notre Dame is French for Our Lady in English. And of course, Notre Dame refers to the Virgin Mary, Mother of Jesus. So good to remember that. It might come up a little later, but this is the Virgin Mary. And we'll move on. So the next picture here is New Orleans. When I was looking for something that matched the New Orleans picture, there was nothing in the esoteric realm that I found that matched it. But what did seem to match was something out of a cathedral. And there are many cathedrals in the world. You can kind of see the outline of a half dome at the top and what appears to be more of like an altar or something in the center. All cathedrals seem to have this kind of a design. So there are a lot to choose from, but there was one in particular that I found that matched pretty well. And that was of a cathedral in Los Angeles called St. Vibiana's. And you could see when you look at St. Vibiana's cathedral, the altar, the shape of the grandfather clock matches pretty much the altar of St. Vibiana's. The effigy of St. Vibiana's matches that of the trapeze artist and the grandfather clock. In the grandfather clock, it kind of has stars and a moon at the top. Right above St. Vibiana, you have something that appears to be kind of star-like. This picture is not in color, so we can't see what color it was exactly. But if you looked at the area where St. Vibiana is placed, that kind of matches what the mask looks like. It looks like it would actually fit perfectly in that section right there. The entire outline of the grandfather clock seems to match pretty perfectly on the exterior design with the New Orleans grandfather clock. So this is what I believe the grandfather clock to be, that of a church altar, namely St. Vibiana's. But there is another church that I found in France that seemed to have kind of the same coloration as that in the grandfather clock New Orleans picture. Here you can see the blue overhead in the dome, kind of matches that. You have a stained glass window in the back, and the shape of this altarpiece right here kind of matches that of the grandfather clock face. So there are other examples of different cathedrals and churches that kind of represent the same as the grandfather clock. So I believe that's what the grandfather clock represents, a church or a cathedral. But as far as the mask goes, I did find something that kind of matched what the mask could be, and that is a Guy Fawkes mask. If you guys ever saw the movie V for Vendetta, you're going to recognize this mask pretty quickly, I'm sure. Also, the hacking group Anonymous uses this mask currently when they put out videos. But you can see the resemblance of the Guy Fawkes mask in that of the Louis Armstrong based mask. They have the same shape in the eyes. The mouth and the grin are very similar, with the exception that the Guy Fawkes mask has a mustache and a goatee. Now, this mask was made popular by a guy named David Lloyd back in 1982, which was around the same time as The Secret came out. And the story behind the Guy Fawkes mask was the guy Guy Fawkes, he was unhappy when King James I of England took over after Queen Elizabeth I had died. King James was actually from Scotland. He was James VI of Scotland, and he was a Protestant. Guy Fawkes wanted to see a Catholic monarch come back into power, so he came up with a plan to blow up the House of Lords and basically kill all of Parliament and the king. This failed. His plot to assassinate everybody with barrels of gunpowder failed, and he was executed. But for a while, they celebrated Guy Fawkes Night using some kind of a mask, not quite the same as the David Lloyd mask, but the David Lloyd mask seems to be somewhat of a perfect representation of what the mask in the New Orleans picture looks like. So in this picture, it seems more like church and things that have to do with religion are the centerpieces of what we're looking at here. And last but definitely not least is the Boston picture. I saved this one for last, not just because it was the cover art of the book The Secret, but because this one genuinely blew my mind more than all the other ones. And the other ones were already somewhat semi-unbelievable, but this one really made me think and think twice about some of these things that I'd been researching. So, as you know, if you watched my other videos about how to solve the secret puzzles, you know that the numbers are embedded in the picture and in the map. For Boston, it's a number 8, and both sides would make an 8. So you can see here's the 8 on the map, and here's the 8 in the picture. Might not look that pretty, but that's what it is. When I was researching esoteric societies and other secret societies, I wasn't having much luck finding anything that fit Boston. Boston kind of seemed like an outlier, and I couldn't find anything. But then I was watching the movie The Da Vinci Code. I'm sure everybody's seen that movie. I researched something in there, and this is what I found. Now, if you've seen the Da Vinci Code, you know that one of the main groups that were named in there was something called the Priory of Sion. The Priory of Sion was supposedly a hoax from the 50s and 60s, but they do have an emblem or a symbol which they use, and this is what it looks like. It has what looks to be an 8. In the middle is a fleur-de-lis, and on the bottom is kind of like a spade or something. If I was to superimpose this emblem on top of the Boston picture, you're going to see that it matches up perfectly with a lot of things in the picture. The 8 goes over the oculus in the back of the woman. The fleur-de-lis matches along the lines of where her hair is. And the bottom of the spade, or whatever the bottom diamond is, matches up almost perfectly with the falcon bird and the 2 globes. It's almost kind of scary that it matches up so perfectly. You know, this came out before the book, The Da Vinci Code. So seeing it on the cover of this book, The Secret, was something very unexpected. Basically, in the 50s, a guy named Pierre Plantard, he planted a whole bunch of documents just to say that he was the Grand Master of the Priory of Sion. And there's a whole bunch of information you can read about on the Wikipedia page. But one thing I did want to show you was the alleged Grand Masters list. A lot of these names from the 11th to the 14th century are names that are close with the Knights Templar. It says in the Grand Masters, it talks about how a lot of these people were associated with the Rosicrucian societies, AMORC, and the Rosicrucian orders. We talked about some of these names previously. Names like Nicholas Flamel. Da Vinci we didn't talk about, but Robert Fludd, Sir Isaac Newton, Victor Hugo, Jean Cocteau. Those are names that we saw previously in the Rosicrucians. So it's very interesting to see that they're listed here under the Priory of Sion. I don't know whether the Priory of Sion is real or not. There's not a lot of information online about the actual organization. Obviously, if they're a hoax, they shouldn't exist. But for it to be featured prominently on the cover of a book called The Secret, that is very telling. I also wanted to mention that there was a book called The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, written by Michael Bagent and Richard Ley. A lot of the theories and hypotheses they used were then kind of taken by Dan Brown and turned into the Da Vinci Code. You guys could read about it if you want, but it's pretty interesting. That's all I can say about it. And with that, that will conclude the esoteric side of the Secret. I'll be talking about a couple of other things about the pictures in The Secret before moving on. But I did want to mention one website real quickly, and it's actually a YouTube channel called Symbol Sage. I use this channel to help me do a lot of research on some of the things that we talked about from alchemy, Freemasonry, Masonic symbols, Zoroastrianism, and a whole bunch of different things. The Ouroboros we talked about a little bit. If you're interested in learning about some of the esoteric societies that I mentioned in this video, I highly recommend you check out this channel, Symbol Sage, on YouTube. So thanks a lot, and I'll talk to you in the next one.